I was curious if sort of in your experience in Minneapolis, I mean, do you feel like there's some process, even if it's not being talked about, of like who is the we and who isn't, and like how that's kind of playing out?
Well, that's interesting and kind of hard to answer. So I'm going to tell kind of a narrative of events that I think is related to and provocative of a lot of the questions that are being thrown around about who's the we and what kind of organizations should emerge out of this, networks versus organizations. So very early on, after the precinct burned, there was this narrative that started gaining momentum that our governor, Tim Walz, said that 80% of protesters were outside agitators. The mayor of St. Paul, Melvin Carter, said that everyone arrested was outside agitators in St. Paul. Turned out to be bullshit. There's like stuff on NPR and KSTP, a local news network. It's clear that under 20% of people arrested were from outstate, and even so, I don't think that means that they were, agitators. I don't. But regardless, there was some truth to that because in the days following, there were people that found kind of threatening letters on their windshields, telling them to, take the signs out of their windows or else they're going to get shot at. Black Lives Matter signs or Justice for George Floyd signs. There was a case of a local Jamaican restaurant that was kind of organizing, like mutual aid distribution that got kind of drive-by shot at. No one was killed, thankfully, but a few tires were popped. And there were just these kind of scattered appearances of, seemingly kind of right-wingers or white supremacists who are actually doing kind of vigilante violence. In response to that, a lot of communities, a lot of neighborhoods, a lot of blocks organized these really ad hoc kind of block patrols, defying the curfew. And there was kind of this outpouring. It was really that, I think, more than anything else, and the fear around the kind of these white supremacist agitators, which I think was largely overblown, but this fear kind of sparked this outpouring of sociality. And people, I went to several meetings of, 60, 70 neighbors in the park talking about what our response to this was going to be. And that on the one hand, I think that was really like cool. And I'm trying to do what I can to organize around those, I think if organizations or anything is going to pop up from this, it's going to be on that basis of like organically developing sociality. That is part of what I'm trying to do. And I can talk more about kind of the organizing projects related to that I'm working on as we go on. But a difficulty with that was that people were scared and sometimes responded in really kind of like next doory neighborhood vigilante ways that actually reflected elements of the carceral state. There was a guy with outstate plates who was using drugs in his car, parked on the block one day, and one neighbor like sent to her like WhatsApp block group that I'm in, like, hey, I would like to have a conversation with this guy, but I would like, someone else to come with me, like just to ask what's up with him. They don't want to come. And some other guy responded by like running out of his house with a baseball bat and threatening him. So, obviously like a really violent response. And that is the risk of, especially with something like community safety, that is the risk of like having it just be organized as a network, as a kind of spontaneous association, is that like people can kind of do whatever they want. And, people are coming into this thing with all kinds of different ideas about what the risks are. And so I do think that we really need out of these neighborhood interactions and kind of committees that are emerging, I hope that we are able to implement something longer term. And I also think, earlier I talked about needing more police precincts to burn down in Minecraft. And I think that's true, but also there are people, alongside like wide support throughout the city for this movement, there's also a feeling that I think is understandable of like sadness for some of these businesses that burn down. You know, in a sense, they do represent capital, but in a sense, a lot of these like small businesses and like local restaurants and shit are the only way that people can kind of experience something like community. You know, those are the only ways that people can experience something like you know, being in relation with other people. So there's a question to me of like, how can we institutionalize this in ways that are kind of like emphasize the humanism of this movement and the like the pro sociality of this movement, and not just have it be about like smashy smash, you know? And so those are the kind of things that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, we're talking about Smash Plus.
Exactly.
I do think that's a really important thing to drive in on too, Cole, because in my experience of the organizations and groups that I've been a part of, the one thing that I always came away with is that there is no heart to any of this. There is nothing that makes me feel less alienated than I already feel in my day-to-day life in the world and in the structures of capital. So, maybe it's kind of I can't remember if this was like an old CPUSA member, whoever it was, maybe it was William Z. Foster, but the idea is that whatever we're inviting people into it must be less alienating than their general day-to-day conditions, or else why the fuck would they want to join it? Yeah, I mean, smashy smash is great, but what happens after that initial like euphoric rush fades? And to me, at the risk of sounding like a Marxist humanist or some kind of dialectical pessimist humanist, I mean, I think that to me, I don't like, I typically now I think have learned my lesson, and I stray far away from organizations that even begin to like get those hairs standing up on the back of my neck of like, I'm not going to feel any less alienated being part of this organization than I do in my day-to-day life. And I think that is specifically because of the way that they have tried to build institutions. And so, I mean, from my own perspective, yeah, I don't even bother unless it has that element of sociality that I think is, a really necessary corrective experience to what most of us have in our day-to-day lives.
Right. And I think that's exactly the kind of question that the autonomous zone, the occupation in Seattle is attempting to answer. And I think the question is, like at what point do you pivot from that like guerrilla uprising into somewhere where you're actually like taking physical space and recreating a commons that is not the private, that is not the public, but it is the common, where life within this zone is negotiated continuously in a pro-social way that is in itself, like by its creation, unalienated from the people occupying it. And that's like, for me, like I see, like I've been in these kinds of occupations, and like I see the energy and like the social connection, and there's like, the first time I went to one of these occupations was in Occupy, and like I had like an almost uh it was like kind of like a religiously ecstatic moment, like what Cole was describing with the outbursts and in the uprising. That's how I felt about Occupy, but that wore away very quickly because, like, while it was in this small thing, like so beautiful and so connected in this social way, it was also incredibly stifling and limited because it was stuck there, and because it was essentially just camping out on the streets in an urban environment waiting for someone to come in and like kick your tent over. There was this inherent lack of any sense of like permanence or future within it. And so when I see something like the Chaz pop up, like I see that kind of same thing over again, and I have to question, like, if that's what they want to do, they can't you can't have just like a little piece of it. You have to be claiming the entire thing in order to have that make any kind of sense, at least for me. Which is why I'm really like deeply like existentially struggling with this notion of in order to create the space for that, we have to have an uprising so general that it essentially grinds the entire state apparatus to a halt. And then as the state withdraws and regroups, like, we have to take in a vast amount of territory, even like measured in square miles, not city blocks. And yeah, I don't know what to do with that feeling.
I just want to say that there is a really important historical point here that I think is missed by most, radicals of all stripes that I've encountered, whether it's about the Russian Revolution and the Petrograd Soviet, or whether it's about Rojava today, is that the thing that created the possibility for that space to open, where that much territory could be taken, was precisely in the context of a very, very weakened state apparatus. This is also the case of what happened in Peru with Shining Path and the Maoist guerrillas down there, and even a lot of Maoists don't think about this, is that the reason why they were able to do what they did is precisely because the state was so fragmented and weak and couldn't occupy territory. And so I think it's a really important thing that we have to, I think, historically ground ourselves in an analysis of that, is that, if that's kind of the main threat, then, there's a question of us building up enough power to counteract it and to, overtake it. Or the other option is that power is weakened to the degree that we get to punch above our weight.